Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
He persevered. He managed to hold on. He didn't pass out. Pastor at last, Charles Stanley's family disbands quiet until his final days. It's not lovely. For half a century, Charles Stanley taught family values to millions. However, behind closed doors, his own family was disintegrating. His spouse filed for divorce. His kid left the church. His daughter observed everything collapse. Now, several years following his passing in 2023, at last, they are conversing. What they disclosed about his last days will be shocking. You. In the pulpit, the man wasn't female in the house. Additionally, the final 3 sentences he ever spoke altered everything between both him and his son. On September, Charles Stanley was born, 25th of 1932 in Dry, a tiny town in Virginia Fork. It was midway through the Great Depression when families and employment were scarce, were starving, and there seemed to be little chance for millions. Charlie Stanley, his parents, Rebecca Hall and I were just beginning Toby. Blocks of red lines extended. Overnight, homes were lost. It was the worst period to be a parent. However, in some way, the soil was formed from that tumultuous beginning, through which one of the strongest, there would be an increase in Christian ministry voices. 9 months following Charles's birth, everything was different. His dad passed away abruptly, at the age of 29. One day, the next one was gone, and he was there. No farewell, only a name, no memories left behind, and quiet. Rebecca, his mother, was abandoned to care for a baby by themselves throughout the biggest financial crisis in American history. That feeling of desertion persisted. Charles, he talked about growing up a lot. Heartbroken, he was wondering what kind of man his father was might have come under his direction. That desire influenced his subsequent, described God as the Father who is always, departs without forgetting and without turning away. Rebecca was 9 years old when Charles remarried. She believed she was carrying out the giving her son the father was the correct thing to do. He had misplaced the figure. However, that choice almost ruined them both. Her recent John Hall, the husband, was an alcoholic, with a furious rage. The nightmare started, nearly right away. After the wedding, 2 weeks later, Rebecca discovered she had married into deception. Paul had been duped by her own family. They was aware of his abuse. They informed her that he would be different if he married. He didn't. Charles was much more terrified. He observed his mother being strangled by his stepfather. Every night he shut the door to his bedroom. He occasionally even carried a loaded firearm by just in case, his bed. He was a kid, residing in a conflict zone. The trauma didn't simply leave him scarred. It shaped him. It imparted knowledge. Him that religion is necessary for survival, and that the only person you can trust is God, not man. Genuinely trust. Despite the mayhem, Charles took solace at home in the church. He has Pentecostal roots. His George Washington Stanley, my grandfather, founded the Emmanuel Pentecostal Church of Holiness at Dry Fork. His parents were engaged participants, and Charles drenched despite the ferocious preaching, clamorous prayers, and intense feeling that accompanied Pentecostal worship. On the worst evenings that he would hide in the church at home, the basement. He prayed aloud there, weeping, yelling, and pleading with God for tranquility. He discovered how to give his all in, don't just whisper the prayer. Even when later on he converted to Baptistism, which he never lost his Pentecostal zeal, influenced his speech, his preaching, and his leadership style. Something at 17 occurred that completely altered everything. Charles went to Siler to see his grandfather, North Carolina City. He wasn't sure about pursuing a career in preaching. He thought too young, too damaged, too frail. However, his grandfather sentenced him to direct his life. Charles, if according to God, you should put your head through, then you bolt for that brick wall. It's His responsibility to dig the hole. That instant, like thunder, strike him. After that, his. The fundamental idea became clear: respect God and let Him handle the fallout. It wasn't merely a motto. It was a matter of survival. When life refused to respond, submission was his anchor. The 1950s saw Charles start his formal schooling. He began at the Richmond University and thereafter went to Southwestern Baptist, Fort Worth Theological Seminary, Texas. This occurred when the Bible college enrollment had increased since 1945. The world was rapidly changing, and Christianity was discovering a new voice on television and radio. Billy Graham's advocacy work had begun in 1949. Evangelism was spreading across the country. Force. Charles jumped right in, learning theology, Hebrew, Greek, and preaching. He wasn't merely studying Scripture, he was learning how to make it real in people's suffering. Charles was only 25 by 1957, although currently teaching and acting as a pastor preaching at the Baptist Church in Fruitland in North Carolina. There was a tiny church, roughly 150 residents in a settlement in the mountains, although it was just what he required. He instructed evangelism and homiletics at the Bible while pastoring the adjacent institute full-time. His weekly pay was only $75. He didn't care, though. He was carrying out his cherished. He was gaining knowledge about leadership, how to communicate, and how to connect with others in challenges in the actual world. A large number of his members were farmers or manufacturing, workers involved with uncertainty and destitution. He provided them over sermons. He handed them over hope. As of 1958, he was formally received their Baptist ministerial ordination at exactly 26 years old. That was a really young age. The majority of pastors were ordained in their 30s. Charles, however, was prepared. His time was ideal. Evangelism on television was blowing up. Billy Graham appeared on All Channel. Roberts, Oral, had just launched his own ministry on television. Charles would shortly adhere too. In the same year, he was ordained. A certificate granted him the authority to lead congregations, get married, and perform baptisms. However, more significantly, it signaled the beginning of a brand new type of ministry that would ultimately reach millions of people worldwide. The world. From 1959 to 1968, Charles moved a lot. First to Ohio's Fairborn, Miami, Florida, followed by Bartow, Florida. Every church introduced new difficulties. He was a church leader in Fairborn, not close to a sizable Air Force installation. The town was expanding quickly because to the Cold War. Accumulation. He served as a preacher in Miami during the missile crisis in Cuba and witnessed his doubled from 400 to more than 800 churches participants. However, despite his achievements, he continued to move. By 1968, he adopted a more compact church in the peaceful 12,000-person city of Barton Individuals. Many would consider that a step backward, but Charles found it to be an opportunity to create something tangible. He wished to begin anew and develop deep roots. That time when you were restless wasn't a failure. It was a training session. He was honing his abilities, picking up knowledge from each neighborhood, and anticipating the moment that would make all the difference. Charles Stanley's initial entrance in 1969, the First Baptist Church in Atlanta. He was unaware of the type of conflict he was entering. The church was divided. There were conflicts between factions concerning theology and politics. Additionally, Stanley, simply the associate pastor, was directly then the center of it. One meeting became really heated. He was genuinely punched. However, he didn't leave. He was there for 2 years of brutality and length. He put up with the tension, the campaigns of whispering, and the blatant animosity. Then October arrived, January 1, 1971. On that day, there was a standing vote to determine whether Stanley ought to be senior pastor. There was tension in the room. Although feelings were intense when the votes were tallied, the response was obvious. Indeed, Stanley was now 39 years old and the 16th pastor of one of the most powerful churches. However, it arrived at a cost. Many of his opponents left, permanently abandoning a church that was broken and battered, but at last, all set to go. Only a year, he eventually took a risk that was considerably greater. Stanley started the Chapel Hour in 1972 on 2 local television stations in Atlanta, C-Wonk 46 and TV1. It was only 30 minutes. Display. Nothing spectacular, but it got to 16,000 viewers in the area, which was enough to draw notice. Behind the scenes, Christian networks were looking for voices that seemed realistic and authentic. Stanley's straightforward Bible teaching was a good fit. In 1978, the Christian Broadcasting Network made contact with Out. A new satellite was being constructed, system and required material. Stanley stated, "Indeed." His audience jumped in just 1 week, from a national average to 16,000 in Atlanta, reach. The application was renamed Speaking with Dr. Charles Stanley, as well as a completely different identity. By the early 1980s, it appeared on television in nearly all major cities in America. Then it spread over the world. Stanley's message was ultimately being broadcast over 150 languages in 114 nations. However, his media conglomerate didn't. Let's start with cameras. It started with classrooms. In 1966, 5 years prior to his television, subsequently, Stanley established the George Miami's Muller Christian School. He was still serving as First Baptist's pastor. At the time, Miami, the educational institution, wasn't only in terms of schooling, it concerned principles. It bears George's name, Muller, a well-known Christian leader who provided for orphans by relying solely on prayer and faith. It was that name. He didn't simply abandon the church. He departed from the whole dynasty. He was meant to take over the pulpit. Rather, he separated and launched his own church. 1995 saw him gather a group of individuals and established North Point Community Church. It wasn't merely a novel construction. It was an entirely new way of thinking. Atlanta doesn't need another church. It requires a secure area for those who do not attend church. It poked fun at everything without being subtle. Represented by his father's ministry. At the conclusion of the first year, more than 4,000 people were going to North Point. The church now serves more than 43,000 people to individuals in various places. It was an independent empire, and it had Charles Stanley is unrelated. The one of the largest ministries was Father's around the globe. The son constructed one of the biggest churches in the nation, and they had not even exchanged words. Their conflict turned into a legend. The Christian media was unable to stop discussing regarding it. Everybody had an idea, an affair, mental disease, problems with control, envy. No matter the cause, the quiet between a father and son came to represent everything about. Evangelicalism is flawed. Leadership. 2 male instructors forgiveness but was unable to extend it to another. After a while, they attempted weekly sessions, therapy, and brutal sincerity. Andy once questioned the counselor, "When do I stop trying to help my dad?" The counselor, "When your heavenly Father spoke, gives up on you." That statement struck a deep chord. Painfully and slowly, they started speaking once more. One lunch meeting was altered. Everything. Charles turned to face his son. "I don't want us to end up being similar to every other father and son." Softly, Andy said, "Me neither, Dad." Andy's North Point community by 2013, the church now had over 30,000 members throughout 5 campuses. It was now the second biggest church in the United States. Even more astounding, his Charles Stanley, the same man's father who had previously felt left behind by Andy's exit, positioned himself at his own pulpit and fervently and publicly praised him. Charles, the same one who had previously taken subtly making fun of Andy in sermons, now told his congregation with pride about plans for planting at Andy's church. He even granted his approval. In private, Charles acknowledged it wasn't easy to say such remarks. Although the wounds were still raw, he stated them nevertheless. That favor signified a significant change. Years before, they could hardly talk. But as time goes on, things altered. They didn't merely talk. They preached for one another's congregations. The same dad who once thought his son was he was now viewed as a partner by the rebel. Additionally, Andy, never forget that, he was aware that he had a first-row seat as a child. Gaining knowledge from among the most influential preachers in Charles, had led the First Baptist Church in America at Atlanta for more than 50 years. He would even served as the Southern Baptist Church's president. Convention. However, he was now observing a new generation is led by son. During the latter months of Charles's life, everything slowed down. He was unable to move. He sat in a large, leather recliner all day. His physique is no longer strong enough to support him, but his heart and mind are still sharp, still burning. Andy frequently came to visit, and whenever he knelt next to that chair, they would converse. Charles would then say, "Support me." This became their new motto, rhythm, a soothing rhythm. Andy stated, "The value of those visits cannot be expressed." That chair turned into a hallowed area, a representation of harmony between two guys who had formerly been far away. Charles is no longer stood on platforms. He stopped thundering from the pulpit. However, in that chair, by means of silent prayers, he discovered anything equally potent. It hadn't been this way forever. Once upon a time, when they had quiet dinners and tents, they would sit in eateries, being aware that they ought to speak, but not understanding how. Charles's divorce and Anna, Andy's mother, had broken not merely a marriage. It had trembled, their father-son relationship. Charles said that he was worried about what might occur between them. "We've both witnessed what happens to sons and fathers who leave by means of something like this," he said, Andy once. "And I'd prefer not for that to occur to us." That anxiety drove them to rebuild gradually and progressively. It almost took 25 years. Then the words that altered everything. "I couldn't be, Andy. I'm more proud of you." He added more than once. It turned into a habit. He didn't intend it simply. He desired for Andy to recognize it. From Charles Stanley, those were powerful words. It was said by Andy. Best. A word's origin establishes its mass. Charles had the option to wait, to old disputes. Andy had made a brave decision. Religious positions, including those that stirred feathers. He questioned customs. However, Charles never publicly reprimanded him. He never took offense to Andy's opinions on LGBTQ+ concerns or the Old Testament. Rather, he repeated those 7 words, and again, and they fixed something that wasn't sermon ever could. The last second, there was something unusual between them. Tailbook. It was Saturday evening in April, on 15th, 2023, 3 days prior to Charles died. Andy came as usual, He anticipated the same pattern. Drop to your knees, say a prayer next to the chair, listen to a thank you quietly. However, this time, something changed. As Andy rose to depart, Charles inquired, "May I offer prayers for you?" It was the only occasion he had that. At the time, Andy was unaware of it, but it would be his father's final action. Never speak to him. After saying a prayer, he repeated it. "I am incredibly proud of his last words were, 'You,' Andy. To his son. 30 a.m. On April 18th, a Tuesday, Charles Stanley died in 2023. He was 90 years old. His ministry had began at the age of 14. It was over after traveling to each continent via 3,800 TV and radio stations in 150 nations. Translations of his sermons were made into 114 other languages. He spent 66 years delivered a sermon. He was in charge of First for 50 of those. Atlanta Baptist. In 2020, he resigned, 2020 becoming an emeritus pastor. However, this was not the end of the mission. His In Touch Ministries continued and continue today. His daughter, Becky Stanley Browerson, made few public declarations. However, she endured it all, the ministry highs and lows for the family. She noticed her father's commitment to his profession, but the toll it took, too. Their mom, in 1993, Anna, filed for divorce. It wasn't decided upon until 2000. Later, she stated Charles would not acknowledge their union, was disintegrating. Becky observed her. The bond between parents ends in public, yet she remained near. She was when the last chapter was composed. Additionally, her name in the obituary stood next to Andy's In Touch Ministries didn't merely make it through. It developed into one of the strongest historical networks of evangelicals. It began in 1972 as the Chapel Hour. As of 2017, it was shown on more between 200 and 800 stations, which corresponded to 114 languages and connecting with individuals in 150 nations. Only in the United States it was on 300 TV networks and 500 radio stations. Even isolated tribal communities, Charles Stanley's sermon was heard thanks to digital and satellite outreach. When he stepped, the sermons continued, down. They were archived, made permanent, prepared for the following generation. However, none of that adequately conveyed the paradox at the core of his existence. Charles Stanley, a family educator ideals, unable to support his own family from disintegrating. His spouse strolled away. At one point, his son felt deceived. His daughter seen the price of a worldwide ministry up close. He gave sermons on healing, but had to acquire the necessary skills. Himself, his father was an alcoholic, a stepfather. That urge for survival. He was a tough and uncompromising individual, strongman in the pulpit. However, it also made living with him difficult. That contradiction didn't make his point less clear. It succeeded, actual.